Good morning and welcome to today's meeting of the Seattle Planning Commission. On behalf of the Commission, we'd like to actively recognize that we are on Indigenous land, traditional and current territories of the Coast Salish people, who have lived on and stewarded these lands since the beginning of time and continue to do so today. We acknowledge the role that traditional Western-centric planning practices have played in harming, displacing, and attempting to erase Native communities, and we commit to identifying racist practices and strive to center restorative land stewardship rather than unsustainable and extractive use of the land. So again, welcome. All regular meetings of the Seattle Planning Commission are open to the public, but please note that the Planning Commission does not hold public hearings because the Commission is an advisory body. We do provide recommendations to elected leaders who in turn make the actual decisions. We encourage individuals and organizations to provide their comments appropriately to elected officials. Today's meeting is a hybrid meeting where some people are participating remotely and some are participating in person in the Boards and Commissions room at Seattle City Hall. Ahead of today's meeting, I invited Commissioner Matt Hutchins to choose and briefly speak to one of our color brave space norms that may be of particular relevance to today's agenda. Matt?
Morning, everyone. I picked practice examining racially based systems because if we're talking about the Equitable Development Initiative and just how zoning in the past has been has reflected racial structures, and the idea that with this initiative we're undoing some of that harm actively, and I thought that for me is the one that was the closest to today's work.
Thank you, Matt. I really appreciate you taking that on. It was very well said. Thank you so much. So if everybody's in agreement, are there no modifications or amendments? I suggest we all agree to these norms, and if I don't hear anything, we'll just continue, assuming that they are. Great. So today's agenda, we have someone would like to add to that. Go ahead, please.
Thanks, this is Jamie. I just wanted to share in case because I think Matt picked an appropriate one for this. PSRC just came out with their story map about the legacy of structural racism. So I dropped the link in the chat, and I haven't had time to work through the whole thing yet, but it seems like a pretty cool interactive tool, and encourage folks to check it out.
Great, thanks, Jamie. So we have one agenda item today. It's an update from the Office of Planning and Community Development on equitable zoning. But first we need to approve the minutes. I would ask for a motion and a second to approve the minutes, and then we can discuss any changes or amendments we may need to make.
I move to approve.
That was Matt.
Second. Yeah.
And Michaela seconded. Great, thank you. Any changes or amendments? Hearing none, I'll call for the vote. All in favor of approving the minutes, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? Any abstentions? And the minutes are approved. Thanks very much. So the next Housing and Neighborhoods Committee meeting is Thursday, August 3rd. It's a 7:30 meeting, 7:30 to 9. And it will be held online with the MS Teams platform. Our next full commission meeting is scheduled for Thursday, August 10th. That's also a morning meeting, 7:30 to 9. And that will be, like today's meeting, a hybrid meeting, both in person and via Teams. I'd like to hand it over to Vanessa for some announcements and commission business.
Thank you, David. As noted before, this is a hybrid meeting being held both in person and via MS Teams. I just want to review the format of the meeting for members of the public. We do have 3 members of the public joining us here in the Boards and Commissions room this morning. Thank you all for coming. During the meeting, there will be opportunities for questions and comments from commissioners. We will be using the chat function of MS Teams for commissioners to join the discussion queue, including those joining in person, but I can help facilitate that, Nick. I'd like to remind commissioners that the chat function is not for substantive comment. It is really just to be recognized to speak. As members of the public, both those here in the room and those who may be listening in do not have access to that chat. I'd also like to note for members of the public listening in and for those joining us this morning, Jamie mentioned that she put a link in the chat to the PSRC story map recently released on structural racism. Links to any links that commissioners put in the chat as a resource to other commissioners will be included in the minutes that will from this meeting that will be approved at the next meeting. So you'll have access to that. If you would like to have access to those links before the next meeting when the minutes are approved, feel free to reach out to me. My name is Vanessa Murdoch. You'll hear that in the introductions in a minute at Seattle.gov. So public comment. We have public comment at 2 points in our agenda. I have not received any emailed public comment, so I will not be reading any. We do have at least one member of the public joining us here that would like to offer public comment at the end of the meeting at 8:55 or whenever we finish the our 8 o'clock agenda item. So with that, I will ask David to start the introductions. After introducing yourself, please call on a fellow commissioner to introduce themselves, and then we'll conclude with staff.
Great. Good morning, everyone. David Goldberg, he, him pronouns, co-chair of the Seattle Planning Commission with Michaela. And I live in the Wallingford Urban Village and work for the State Department of Transportation. And I'll call on Michaela to go next.
Happy to. Michaela Daffern, she, her pronouns. I am calling in today from my neighborhood in Capitol Hill. I work in affordable housing policy and planning. And I think that's it. Okay, I will call on Jamie.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Jamie Strobel, use she, her pronouns, and I live in the future 130th Station area, and I work in climate change and environmental justice. And I will pass to Lauren.
Hey everyone, good morning. Lauren Squires, she, her. I live in the Mount Baker Station area, and I'm a transportation planner. Andy, do you want to go next?
Sure. Andy Dannenberg, he, him, live in Northeast Seattle, and I teach at the University of Washington in both public health and in urban planning. I can't see who else is there.
How about Matt?
Okay.
I'm Matt Hutchins. I am an architect. I use he, him pronouns. I work or live in West Seattle and work with the state.
How about Deanna?
Yeah, Deanna, thanks.
Good morning, Diana Quintanar. I use she, her pronouns. I live in Capitol Hill, and I'm a multimodal transportation planner. And Vanessa, I'll ask you to pass it over to whoever you else identify us on.
Thanks, Deanna. Nick.
Good morning, Nick Whipple. I use he, him pronouns. I live in West Seattle in the North Del Ridge neighborhood, and I work at the City of Bellevue as a code and policy planner.
Thank you. Olivia.
Good morning, everyone. Olivia Baker, I use she, her pronouns, and I'm staff to the commission. Huh?
Good morning, I'm John Hoy. I'm staff to the Planning Commission. I use he, him pronouns.
Good morning, all. I'm Vanessa Murdoch, staff to the commission. I use she, her pronouns. And that concludes our introductions. I'll turn it back to you, David.
Okay, so I guess we're ready for our first agenda item.
We are.
Katie Hema and Nick Welch from the city's Office of Planning and Community Development are joining us to update us on the equitable zoning work they've been leading. Following their presentation, I'll facilitate our discussion, first by asking commissioners for any clarifying questions. If you don't have a question, feel free to pass, and I'll circle back to you at the end of the question portion of our discussion. Following the questions, for the clarifying questions, we'll open up to the floor to comments. Vanessa will assist in monitoring the queue and ensuring that all commissioners have the opportunity to participate. We'll have 55 minutes for this agenda item. And I guess we're ready to go.
Hello, everyone. Sorry, I'm just waiting. Has Nick? I don't think Nick has gotten here yet into our virtual room. There he is. Okay. All right. Hi, Nick. We are up. So thank you so much for having us today. We're going to pull up a presentation. As we do that, my name is Katie Hama. I work for the Office of Planning and Community Development. I am a former Planning Commission staff, so it's nice to see some familiar faces still around. Also fun to see some new faces. Nick, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Nick Welch, he, him. I'm in OPCD's land use policy group with Katie. Thanks for having us.
Great. Nick, do you have it up and ready to go?
Yeah, I can bring it up.
Okay, cool.
All right, let's make sure I share the right screen here.
I know that's too many tabs open, right?
Classic question. All right.
Amazing. So again, thank you so much for having us. We came to the commission, I think last year in October, to give you sort of an update on what was happening at that point. So we have some great news about things moving forward. So we'll talk a little bit about our adoption of phase 1 and also sort of where we are headed in the future. So a little bit about equitable development zoning, just a recap of sort of what we are talking about. We'll go through some of the themes that we heard from our stakeholders, and then we'll talk more specifically about the actual strategies.
So some of this may look familiar to those of you who have a good memory of what we presented back in 2022. But the real genesis of this work is taking stock over the last several years of how the Equitable Development Initiative, or EDI, has been going and has been working for projects. We've gotten a lot of feedback, and EDI really originated because we knew that community-based anti-displacement projects were facing a lot of financial barriers that we needed to support. And in the years since EDI has begun, 6-7 years, we've found that those projects they get funded, and they still run into a lot of challenges when they come in to get a permit, or when they just even try to sort of navigate the world of real estate and development. Those include the projects that get held up by the complexity of the code or delayed, additional costs that they often have to face because of the types of projects and uses that they are proposing, and sometimes even just the sort of mismatch between the zoning for a site that they have and the proposed program and use that they have in mind. Of course, all of this is in a context of a really specialized field that many projects need professional support to kind of navigate, and that takes resources and distracts from the really critical work that these organizations are trying to do. So as that became increasingly clear, this idea of trying to align our land use policy more closely with the goals that we have for equitable development started to feel like a meaningful thing to pursue. So we outlined this kind of purpose statement of trying to help these projects be successful by removing barriers in the code, and we'll tell you a little bit about some of the recent progress on that and where we're going, helping these organizations get access to the development process so that works more equitably through resources and supports, and then over time shifting our overall system to really prioritize these types of community-driven equitable development and anti-displacement projects.
So we had some early conversations with EDI applicants in 2021 as a lot of projects were running into issues. It was clear that trying to solve these at a case-by-case basis just was time-consuming, not efficient. We weren't really solving the underlying problems. So we started a formal work program to explore potential solutions, hence the EDZ program. So our first step was to learn more. We worked with EDI to identify those applicants who were interested in having conversations with staff about the land use and zoning issues that they were running into. So we interviewed them, and we got a little bit deeper into some of those specific challenges that they were facing, including some of these bullets, which I'll just run through, and some of the examples that we'll show you later. But largely the key themes were that, there's a lot of different layers of city regulations that were creating challenges for them. A lot of the times the sites that are available and affordable for these organizations, they don't accommodate their proposed uses. The zoning tends to be for, NR or something much less dense, or that doesn't allow the types of uses that they want to have in their projects. Our existing zoning, just sort of as the system of zoning, doesn't generally facilitate or encourage equitable development outcomes. The permitting process is very complex and costly, particularly for organizations who, they're not developers. They have a different mission. And that the real estate market is just a very, it's complex, and it really favors larger, more experienced developers rather than these small organizations. So these were some of the early themes that came out of those conversations that really led us to the next stage, which was setting up a stakeholder group. So in 2022, we convened a stakeholder group, a lot of EDI applicants, sort of a broad range of expertise, from people who are a little bit more involved in development to people who are just, trying to make their projects happen. And we had a series of meetings, so you can sort of see all the areas of expertise on the left-hand side. We had a series of meetings to really try to develop what the program is and how we can approach the issues sort of at a much more foundational level to really try and solve them across the board. So from that, we sort of broke up the work into a few different phases. We looked at some just permitting support. We looked at some sort of near term, just, kind of quicker tweaks we could make to the code just to remove some barriers. And then we also really looked to transformative sort of long-term vision ideas. And so all of these were things that we talked about with this group. Yeah, I think I hit everything here. So as I kind of mentioned, the strategies we're pursuing fall into sort of three general buckets. So there's this sort of ongoing thing, which is permitting support for EDI projects. There's no world in which we can just be like, you get a permit with no reviews. There still needs to be some level of review. And so we have worked with SDCI to sort of identify some permit reviewers who can help those EDI grantees navigate the permitting. And we are sort of still looking to see, how we can scale this role and to provide more support for projects in the future. This is particularly great for projects where they don't have a lot of development expertise. They might just want to do one project. They're not looking to make this their career, and so they do need that additional help to get their projects through. I think the last time we came, we were talking about the second one, the highlighted one here, which is the near-term code changes. And so for this one, we looked at sort of smaller code tweaks that would just look to remove some barriers that EDI projects were facing. So we actually worked to propose some legislation, which was recently adopted by council and signed with the mayor. So we'll walk through those code changes in detail. But again, just sort of looking ahead, we do see a need to provide greater flexibility in our zoning code for equitable development projects. And so that's really what we're looking at right now. And we'll talk about that sort of at the end of at the presentation. But right now we'll talk a little bit about those different phases in detail.
So just to elaborate on where Katie started, the easiest sort of first thing to get going was to have staff in SDCI that would help EDI applicants navigate the permitting process. Most of them are doing it for the first time. And not only are they sort of first timers facing this, complex system, but their projects are often not particularly straightforward. They might be, being innovative. They're trying different things, and that might include a mix of uses. And a lot of EDI projects include a combination of affordable housing with other non-housing space that serves the community, like a gathering space or an arts and cultural facility. And we'll explain more of what those barriers are and how we've tried to address them. But even just understanding how the city regulates those different uses and where they might be allowed or not allowed, or allowed only in a certain way, is tricky. And so the staff in SDCI that have some time to assist are really important. It's probably a role that we need to scale up over time, especially if we want to grow the number of EDI projects that we're supporting. But that's been up and running, and we work closely with them to sort of connect EDI stakeholders with that technical support.
All right, and so the next phase, the sort of that near-term code changes, which I think we talked about the last time we were here about where we were headed with that. Surprise, it's done. So we'll just talk a little bit about that. So the problem was when we interviewed a lot of the stakeholders, we realized that a lot of the projects were being permitted as community centers, which is a type of institution in our code. And so there's a lot of things in our code that put in, administrative conditional uses for that. So there's this sort of uncertainty in your permitting process. There's sort of there's a lot of extra regulations about dispersion and all these things that place restrictions on the site they can use and the design and sort of the actual project and how it fits within that site. So we looked at a lot of that, and then we looked at our code and tried to find out what are the ways that we could tweak this to really make it easier to permit those things while still being aware of the potential impacts and where we need to still regulate those, put it more into the code sort of as a black and white instead of this discretionary review. So we developed legislation. It was adopted by council and signed by the mayor in July and should become effective on August 16th. And we can walk you through the actual sort of specifics of it. So sort of 6 main areas. The first one, as I mentioned, a lot of these projects are permitted as community centers. So it would allow community centers and libraries, there are some libraries also, as institutions. They are institutions. It would allow them sort of outright in our neighborhood residential zones. They already allowed outright in low-rise and neighborhood commercial, but allowing them outright in neighborhood residential really opens up, a big chunk of the city to where these things could be located. We modified the off-street parking requirements. They were outdated. They required the use of a lot of the site for surface parking, which really, hampered the projects and sort of how big they could build or how they could organize their site or the types of open space and other programming they could have on site. The third one, we actually created a new category of institution called community farms. We have a couple different definitions for sort of agricultural uses in the code, but none of them really fit the sort of mission-based, like community organized type of community farm that would also let you sell your produce. One of the important things about that we really worked with these stakeholders is that a lot of them are nonprofits. They do require revenue to keep their programming going and to keep their mission alive. And so being able to sell products produced by community farms is a really important part to helping those continue to operate. We modified the definition of community club to really better reflect the types of activities and programming that we actually see in our EDI projects. There wasn't necessarily like an inherent conflict happening. We really just sort of broadened the definition to make sure that there really wasn't any question that these projects could fit under that definition. The fifth one, we allowed community centers to include accessory commercial uses. And so this is a pretty big one, similar to what I said with the community farms. One of the really important things here is that these organizations can generate some revenue. And so we decided to allow accessory commercial uses for community centers, so they would be run by nonprofits as a requirement. There's sort of an inherent size and relationship with an accessory commercial use, so it does need to be related to the programming in the community center. And we heard this a lot from applicants who said, we'd like to have a small cafe on the site so that we can employ some of the youth in the community and like job train, or we'd like to have a storefront where we can sell the produce we grow, or we'd like to have a storefront where we could sell like crafts and goods made in, in the community center from the community. So those are the types of uses that we're really envisioning. And then finally, this is a small one, but for whatever reason, in LR zones, there was a larger setback requirement for institutions than for any other use. So we just synced those up. But those were the 6 main things in that piece of legislation that just passed, and that will be enacted in August. So that is our great news, is that phase 1 is sort of completed.
Just to Katie, I can speak to this one
Yeah,
briefly. Just to pause for a second, like,
yeah.
It's easy for all of us, certainly we as staff included do this, to get kind of focused on the the technical stuff in the code and trying to remove barriers without. We should remember what are the actual implications of this, especially now that it's adopted. It's really nice to bring it back to the projects. These are some examples of kind of a few past projects that went through these challenges that represent the types of projects that could benefit from it, but then also some that where this is like a very active ongoing issue. So the first is Wanawari. Many of you are probably familiar with this, but it's a Black cultural space project that's in the central area. It's located in a single family house in a single family zone. And several years ago when they wanted to, well, first they established this kind of cultural space use, and then after the fact kind of had to go through a really tricky permitting process to get a change of use and a conditional use permit to allow this really wonderful community cultural resource to exist in the house. There was a big cost associated with it. I think it was something like $8,000 or $18,000 to get that change of use permit alone. And so what has passed now would just allow that type of use outright in a neighborhood residential zone. None of the change of use conditional use permit would not be required. Of course, none of what Katie walked through on the previous slide changes the scale of buildings. So it doesn't allow Wanawari or any other community center use to be any bigger than what they could already do and what a residential use could be. But when you want to adapt existing space, now that has a more straightforward process. Nurturing Roots is a really wonderful community agriculture project. Katie worked very closely with them to develop that definition of community farm. They were an accessory use to a church next door, and that was required under the sort of the way that we regulate agricultural uses. And they face this challenge of their lease not being renewed and needing to find a new site. And because we don't have good or didn't have good definitions, there were not a lot of sites where they could easily relocate. And so that new definition of community farm frees up a lot of those limitations and gives them access to a lot more sites around the city. And then the last one is the Cham Community Center. This is a site plan of their community center gathering space project. And you can see, as Katie mentioned earlier, that the parking requirements for a community center use have been so high that in a case like this, more than half of the site is devoted to the required parking, all of that sort of hardscape on the bottom and right side of the plan set there. And so those requirements have now been more right-sized, and that's good going forward. And even for this particular project, which is kind of midstream in permitting, they are considering revising their design, somewhat reduce the amount of parking, and enlarge their gathering space in a way that they couldn't before. So that sort of represents that first milestone, what we've called phase one, as Katie described earlier. And as you saw from the feedback we got through our engagement over the last couple of years, so those are some of the barriers. They're kind of the lower hanging fruit barriers, but we also heard from stakeholders who said, well, what we have is a single family house that we've somehow managed to acquire. And what we want to build is, a mixed use affordable housing project at a much larger scale, something that's just obviously not allowed by zoning. Zoning is just another, major limiting factor. And so we knew that we wanted to get that first phase done as soon as possible, because a lot of projects were currently facing those issues, but that we would want to explore other ways to give even more relief and sort of an increase in feasibility and flexibility for these projects that goes beyond that. So we envisioned some sort of bonus program or incentive program, much as we do for other things in the land use code. But
Nick, I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Please. Did we want to pause? Was there a question?
Sorry, we're having some technical issues in the room.
Got it.
Got it.
Oh, they're having issues with the audio.
Nick, can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yep,
we can hear you.
We can hear you.
you're really breaking up, so if you can give us just about 1 minute. Okay. Katie, can you just hum a few bars to see if it's Nick's
You don't want to
issue
hear me
or
hum.
your issue, or I think it is
La
us.
la 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 la.
We can't hear you at all, Katie.
Okay.
And can you hear me any differently? No,
It
I
is
think
on our end.
It's, yeah.
And I'll just ask commissioners who are on the call, can you hear? Either nod or, okay. Matt
I can hear fine. This is Andy.
I'll leave on this and come back in, so.
Hey, I have patients with
I'll just shut off on here, it'll be on your computers.
Thanks, Andy. We're, if you could all bear with us for a moment, we're going to leave and then come back in to see if resetting helps.
All right. We'll hang out. We'll take a coffee break.
Mhm.
And Nick, sorry to interrupt your flow, man. You were on a roll.
Oh, no worries.
We're almost
worries.
we're almost to the end. It's all good. Almost to the end.
Hopefully you can find your spot again and get back.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So while we're waiting, I think I know the answer to this, but the stakeholders that you mentioned at the beginning, you said that's sort of what their expertise was. I'm assuming they were all folks who had had an experience with doing an EDI project.
Afternoons are usually best. You know, like midday to.
Cool.
They mostly were, David.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess probably the answer is kind of either very directly, like a couple specific applicants or grantees who had, been project proponents, and then some others who had sort of expertise in the design or development fields and were working kind of in that equitable development ecosystem, either like, for example, architects who had worked specifically on EDI projects, but may not have been, the sort of stakeholder or primary proponent of that project. But yes, folks sort of, we tried to get that cross section across the sort of equitable development ecosystem, so to speak.
Great, thanks.
It says issues are fine.
But I'm flexible. I totally
It's there.
We're hearing you. Are you hearing us now?
Behind you for a minute.
Hello, hello.
Yeah, I don't think it's gonna.
Okay.
Are you back?
Yeah, can you hear us, Vanessa?
You're muted, Vanessa, but maybe you can hear us.
Now I'm not muted, and now I'm not echoing. So we are not going to proceed with the live event. I'm going to turn my laptop over towards the members of the public who are joining us this morning, and we will proceed with the meeting. Nick, do you mind going back one slide from the one that's showing up on the screen, and maybe just speak to that slide, and then we'll go through. And I'm going to go sit between John and Olivia and try to monitor the chat from there. So thank you all.
Yeah, way to adapt on the fly, Vanessa.
So feel free to come as close as you feel comfortable doing.
Just give it a minute here while folks get situated in front of the computer. All right, just pause us if you need any more time to get reoriented here, but we're sort of shifting to the final part of our presentation, just a couple more slides. We've moving from this first phase, the legislation that has now been adopted, takes effect next month. But as we did that engagement, we identified, on the one hand, some very near-term challenges in the code, sort of smaller technical things as Katie described them, that we knew projects were facing right now and wanted to move swiftly to try to reduce those barriers. And we also heard in many other cases that there were kind of broader, deeper barriers that projects faced. I think as an example, organizations that may somehow have acquired a single family house or that may be looking to, because as expensive as single family homes are, that property is usually much more affordable than land in a neighborhood commercial zone where you have plenty of capacity, plenty of flexibility to do a bigger project. And of course, if you have a single family property, just as an example, in what we would call a neighborhood residential zone, and your vision is a 5-story mixed use affordable housing project, there's a mismatch there. Zoning is a real fundamental barrier. Projects might consider pursuing what's called a contract rezone, where you get a zoning change, but it's a really high bar. It's a long process. You have to go to the hearing examiner and then get council approval. Lawyers are typically involved, so it's expensive, it's long, and it's very uncertain, and it really is not generally available for single family parcels in particular. So that led us to want to at least explore how we could provide more flexibility, more development capacity, but specifically targeted to equitable development projects. To sort of contrast that, and I'll maybe move now to that next slide. In the land use code changes that Katie walked through, you might have noticed, those originated because many EDI projects include community center or other institution uses, but none of those changes actually specifically is targeted to or reserved for EDI projects. And there is no feasible way for us to say, hey, these are the development standards if you get funded by a certain program. And that seemed okay, but for some of the reasons for like how community centers are defined in the code, for example, they have to be operated by a nonprofit. So we felt good about the way that still would be targeted. But here, when we're starting to really give more value in the form of additional height or floor area, we would want that to be targeted. So the idea kind of arose that we could try to define criteria for what equitable development is, and for projects and uses that meet those criteria, provide in the code alternative development standards. In other words, height, floor area, things that would reduce those zoning barriers further for that set of projects. And so we spent time with the stakeholders exploring what that could be. We sort of landed on the idea that we might want to pilot some of these concepts. And then Katie can walk through kind of where we're at with that as a exciting next step.
Thanks, Nick. So as Nick said, we had a lot of discussions with our stakeholder group on what a pilot could look like. And so with that, we talked a lot about what are the geographies it would apply in, how do we actually define equitable development, how much FAR, what other types of flexibility do we need? So we had a lot of conversations around that to really try and sort of narrow down. And then some work that was happening in Councilmember Tammy Morales' office sort of caught our eye in that there were a lot of, and I hate using this word, but synergies. They were looking to do sort of a lot of things that were in the same vein as what we were doing, similarly with sort of an FAR bonus approach. And so it really seemed that these two work efforts would really like layer and work together instead of having sort of multiple things in the code where you have to pick this or pick that. This is a way to sort of include a lot of those things all in one pilot. And so we are working on combining strategies for reducing those barriers for equitable development and actually really looking to enhance the feasibility of those projects, particularly those projects that are led by CBOs and that have some affordable housing component to them. This legislation would also look to, the pilot would also look to actually define equitable development as a use in the land use code, which is a big step to, then regulating it or providing, different development standards or things for those uses. And then we would be looking to provide, as I said, additional development potential for the eligible projects for the pilot. We're also looking, anytime we say you get a little bit more FAR, there's other challenges that come along with it. Well, okay, I get more FAR, but now I have all these limitations like in our LR zone of facade length and width and all that stuff. So this would also look to simplify those development standards so that you can actually use that FAR for the pilot projects. So we are working right now with Councilmember Morales' office in developing this and bringing in all the great ideas and things that came out of our stakeholder group and trying to bring those into the pilot program and really create sort of one combined pilot program. So looking ahead, Councilmember Morales is really excited to, FAR, floor area ratio, essentially the amount of building that you can build. Thank you, Olivia. So looking ahead, Councilmember Morales is really looking to launch that pilot by the end of the year, and working, very quickly, but also very thoughtfully towards that deadline. We are looking to also continue looking for opportunities about how we can integrate the ideas and the work program of equitable development zoning into our other community planning work. So, for example, stationary planning for the Wisbley extension, that'll sort of be happening in OPCD, and so I think that's a really great area that's just good. They're going to be specific geographies, and we can really work with that team to sort of say what does equitable development zoning mean in our station areas? Are there things that we can do to increase feasibility, to really enhance that and to move that forward. And then we're also looking to explore comprehensive plan policies that would support equitable development to make sure that we're setting ourselves up for the future and some of those visionary things that our stakeholders are really looking for the city to do. I think that's our last slide.
Yeah, that's it.
All right.
Thank you. Would love to hear your feedback or questions.
Fantastic. Well done, you guys. That was very, for the topic, very easy to follow and entirely engaging. So I appreciate your presentation acuity. All right, so we've got a queue of questions with Dalton added, and now because of all the chatter associated with our losing our dear friends downtown, I have to scroll to find the list. Okay, so Deanna, you get to be first. Ask any clarifying questions, followed by Matt and then Lauren.
Right. Nick, Katie, thank you so much. Fantastic presentation, and I commend you for the great work you're doing for our city. I had a question with regards to what are the, when you change the parking requirements, I was just wondering if you could elaborate if there was any specific pushback or challenges around that when doing it for the community center requirements. I'm just curious because I mean that seems incredible, and it's an obvious one, and I'm wondering what were the arguments or the way that you kind of were able to do that with what seems pretty quickly. So that's my question.
Well, thank you for that. Yeah, that's a great question. I'll offer a couple thoughts, and Katie worked on some of the, I think, technical, and we had actually a couple other colleagues who were part of our team who took on pieces of this, and that was one of them as well. Part of what they did was call actual community center projects that had gone through this and say, can you confirm, how many parking spaces do you have? How many parking spaces do you use, and do you really need? And yeah, great. This gives good detail, sort of our back pocket slides that give you all the wonky details of the code. Thanks, Katie. So I think one part of the answer, Deanna, is we really kind of based it on some real world examples from projects who were telling us we just don't need and use all that we have. We also weren't eliminating it. I think that's probably part of the answer too. Eliminating a requirement would get maybe more scrutiny. This is more kind of overusing this phrase here, but right sizing it to that, the need that these projects have. And it's kind of bringing it more, kind of harmonizing it with some of the other ways that we require parking for other uses. I mean, this is 2 rows from a table in a chapter of the code that has, dozens and dozens of rows for all these different types of uses. And you can see each one that gets very precise with making this calculation. It was just kind of overdoing it for a couple of these uses. I think maybe just my final thought of, why wasn't this like a bigger deal? there are relatively few community center projects, even fewer libraries. That's not a common thing. And we looked at that. We actually reviewed, for a number of reasons, all of the community center projects over the last 10 years. And then only some are in residential zones. Only some are actually part of the sort of type of, use that we're talking about here. So not something we're likely to see all of the time with really significant impacts.
Great, thank you.
Matt, did you have a question?
Yeah. First of all, thank you very much for doing this work. As an architect, we've run into these exact issues on some of these mission-driven institution works, and the community farms, parking. They're incredible barriers. So I guess my question is, have you reached out to the AIA, the American Institute of Architects, for example, or to Morales's office to set up maybe like an on-call contract for architects to assist in like the sort of really early process of like, like getting people off the ground?
We haven't yet. I love that idea. It's in the vein of the support sort of pillar of this. I think that the main thing is we've thought when kind of prior to the collaboration with the Morales office, which is pretty nascent, and we will bring this idea up with them. But in our thinking and working with the stakeholder group, we thought it would be nice to have this pilot approach where we could test some things, liberalize some of the requirements for these projects, figure out how this idea of defining a new category of project in the land use code really works. That might sound like a easy, nice, simple thing. It's actually quite complex to try to figure out what that language is. But aside from all of that, we knew, as always, you can, try to improve the way zoning and land use work, but that's only part of the picture. That's not going to obviously address directly any of the financial barriers projects face or the other support that they might need. And so we thought, as we develop that pilot, we should also make sure we've got, either support within the city, but also love the idea of ways to support with other design expertise outside the city. So we would love to explore that further.
Thank you.
Nick, did you have any clarifying questions?
Oh, I do. I'm hearing a mute. I'm at City Hall, so getting an echo on my end. Hold on one sec. Okay. Oh, echo's still there. Is it muted over there? Okay. All right, it looks like the echo is gone. Hopefully you can hear me. All right, great. So I did have just a couple clarifying questions, maybe if I could just put them out there and then have you respond. But Nick and Katie, really awesome presentation. This is exciting work and happy to hear about it too. I was curious, I know, Katie, I think you had mentioned, the permitting process is complex and costly. You're working with SDCI to kind of improve some of that. Curious on the costly piece, if there was any sort of work to look at like fee waiver programs or fee reduction programs or anything to sort of offset that burden, which tends to be an important cost to some of these uses, as you know. Also, when you mentioned like FAR increases or height increases, is that to incentivize those uses within new projects? So the FAR or the height would be given to kind of those like office towers or residential towers or whatever project that those might be sited within. And then the last question, you had mentioned that there were, Katie, I think you had mentioned extra regulations around dispersions for these types of uses. Was that was the setback change in the LR zone to address kind of the dispersion requirements, or were there others that maybe you're hoping to address as part of phase 2, or that or was that it, I guess?
All right. Thanks for the list, Nick.
Oh, sorry. No, I don't think people heard me.
Are we good? Okay. Okay, so permit fees. Yes, we did talk to SDCI about the possibility of waiving fees. Unfortunately, there are a lot of reasons we cannot do that are above my pay grade, but we have a lot of restrictions about just like fairness and things about we can't just like do free things. So the reduction of cost that we were talking about really came from changing the permit for a community center in an NR zone from an administrative conditional use, which requires that discretionary review, which takes a lot longer. It's like just a lot more hours of review. There's a lot more sort of things like all those requirements that you have to show how you meet. So like the dispersion, the noise and all that stuff. And so essentially by removing that and making it a by right use, we have eliminated upfront just a bunch of cost there. So that was the way that we were approaching it. I mean, I think we're definitely open to trying to explore how we could actually reduce fees in the future, but at the moment we're not set up to do that. So that could be one of those long term or like long range things, because it is rather silly. We as the city, award EDI grantees money and then they literally turn around and hand it right back for permit review. And so we understand that is, not great. So thank you for reminding us about that. In terms of the FAR and the pilot, so it's obviously like still in the works, but the idea would be that there's qualifying projects, and those would be, as I kind of mentioned before, essentially led by CBOs. And so it would require it to be a nonprofit. And if that project then includes some equitable development uses in it, we are looking to try to incentivize that. So it might be an exemption, it might be an incentive, like additional, and that's kind of, those are the details that we're working through and, how much, so all of that kind of stuff. And then finally, the extra regulation. So as I said, with the administrative conditional use that used to be required for community centers, particularly in our zones, there were a list of those regulations, one of them being dispersion. You couldn't be, I think, within 800 feet of another institution. And so we looked at the list of those. I think there's maybe like 8, 9, 10 of these sort of things that you had to put in your ACU permit. And we looked at those to try to really understand, what impact is it trying to mitigate here? And is there a way, is it necessary? That code was written a long time ago in a very different Seattle. And 2, if we do think that is a potential impact, can we just codify the requirement instead of making it this sort of loosey-goosey gray area thing? So it's just, here's your standard, you need to have screening type of thing. And so we moved over, some of those things that we thought were still worthwhile to have, largely like screening for certain outdoor uses type of stuff, and got rid of most of those requirements. So there's no longer a dispersion requirement for community centers in NR zones. Did I cover everything? Nick, do you have anything to add to that?
Those are great answers.
Yeah.
I think you covered everything. Just on the last piece, to add a couple other details.
Yeah. Or
underscore one thing you just said. It's only for a subset of institution uses. So that dispersion requirement, I think, was 600 feet, but it meant, if a community center like Wanawari, for example, if that project, when that project went in, it meant that within 600 feet, no other community center project could go in. And specifically, it meant they actually could not do the one thing they're really trying to do on that block, which is kind of curate this little sort of, I'm blanking on the language they've used for it, but a specific sort of arts district, a cultural arts district of other properties in that area. The dispersion is just this immediate barrier to doing that. So for other institutions where the impacts might be bigger and of a different level, A, there's still much more review, and B, things like dispersion might apply. But for these smaller ones, where some of the co-location might actually be an asset, not a greater impact, it removes that barrier.
Thank you for that clarification. All right, who's up next?
Maybe Olivia can.
It appears that David.
Sorry, I had
Gross.
muted myself, but when we get this many participants going, everything is really slow and it takes forever for my thing to unmute. Sorry about that.
No worries.
So we have clarifying questions from Dalton and then Monica. And if you would introduce yourself since you came in after the introductions, that would be great.
Yeah, I'll hop in. So my name is Dalton Owens, project engineer for a general contractor in Seattle. I think the presentation was really great and informative. I wasn't too aware of what was going on with this, so I appreciate y'all stopping by and kind of talking about it. You kind of touched on it already, and you probably touched on it in the beginning and I missed it, but what were the two types of, you said there's been some adjustments in terms of the type of permit that these projects can apply for that like kind of helps expedite that process? Because I had a similar, I don't know, kind of concern to what Matt had mentioned earlier. Just like I've gone through the permit process myself, and I know it's very intense, and sometimes you have deferred submittals, and there's a number of different factors that you have to be kind of knowledgeable about when you're uploading things. So yeah, I just maybe one more time, if you could tell me what the two options were
Totally.
that these projects.
Yeah, so unfortunately, the bad news is we didn't get rid of the permitting requirements for these projects. So for community centers specifically, because it's a type of institution in our code, particularly in our NR zones, which, as you know, are a significant portion of the city, it requires institutions to get an administrative conditional use permit, which is a discretionary permit, which means you have to go get a MUP, a master use permit, which means you have to submit a bunch of additional documentation, not just your plans, about how you meet all of the conditions that the code asks you to do. We now said you don't need to do the administrative conditional use. You can just get a regular permit, just a regular building like construction permit. And so we've removed that discretionary portion for community centers in NR zones. So you still have to do a permit, but we've reduced the burden of all of the additional, things you have to supply, and also that really then shortens the amount of time because you have fewer review cycles because you're not, going through all this discretionary stuff. So it shortens your timeline and makes it a simpler permit. Does that help?
Yeah, that's
Okay,
helpful. Thank you.
Great. Okay. Monica?
Hi, everyone. My name is Monica Sharma. I use she, her pronouns. I am an action team manager with King County Play Equity Coalition. Sorry I was late. I don't know if Microsoft Teams doesn't like me or my computer doesn't like them, but I am really just getting in, so I don't have any comments or questions at this time, but thank you for your patience, everyone.
Thanks for introducing yourself. I do have a question, and then we'll go on to comments. I wonder if there's been any thought given to or any opportunity for some sort of matchmaking between some of these EDI groups and experienced developers. If there's any ways to incentivize collaboration, or if there's an opportunity for some sort of mentorship situation or something like that.
So that is a great point. That I think is actually one of the things that Councilmember Morales is really interested in looking at, of how to encourage those partnerships. And so as we work with her office on developing that pilot, that'll be something definitely at the front of mind, because you're right, part of it is, and we heard this a lot from our EDI stakeholders, of just like building up that ecosystem and really, connecting partners so that we're not always relying on, an outside developer to come in and do it, but really like those groups can get some of that knowledge and, get some of that expertise themselves. So that's definitely something that's very important to us. And so we'll be working towards more of that in the future, but thank you for bringing that up and for making that point. Nick, anything else?
Well, we could maybe also just relay one point from the stakeholder work, like one sort of point of feedback that they gave consistently. We sort of asked, sort of as you're asking, David, like if we structure a pilot and we set up requirements, should it be in a way where everything in the building is kind of under that umbrella of equitable development or maybe affordable housing, or should it be more of an incentive for the private market to seek out those partnerships and then include space for, let's say an EDI grantee in what is otherwise a market rate project? And the group was not split, person to person, but just understood the sort of pros and cons of both. There could be this opportunity if partnerships became really incentivized for there to be new space for EDI type uses in new buildings around the city. And of course, at the same time, there was a lot of concern that if that weren't done the right way with the right requirements and sort of assurances that there's real stability and ownership for that partner, it could easily be exploited in some unintended way. So as Katie said, like the work with the council member now is exploring a partnership, I think, in a robust way. But there was interest in having it be kind of with some teeth, like, an EDI an equitable development organization that owns a commercial condo in a building has a much different role than one that just sort of leases some space initially, and by doing so was the building got to be, you know, 1 story taller or something. That gave people a lot of pause.
Okay, thanks. We've got about 5 minutes before we need to have public comment, and we have a few comments. So let's just try to make them as pithy as we can. Andy, can you lead us off?
Yeah, just real quick. First, I thought this was absolutely terrific and in the right direction. I'm delighted to see what you're doing, and especially glad to see some of those actual examples of how these rule changes, you know, would affect real places that make the city better. Not to open a can of worms, but future work could be reviewing parking minimums for all projects in the city. But that's a whole can of worms, and I hope that will be considered at some future time. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
It's a great can of worms. I appreciate it.
Yeah, we're all eager to open that can of worms. Michaela, comment?
Yeah, reflecting just back on the last discussion, I really do appreciate the elevation of the pros and the cons with kind of matchmaking and kind of forcing partnerships on community-based organizations. It has to be done with a lot of thought and care to making sure that the both partners, but particularly the community-based organization, is not exploited in that process. So I've seen it happen, and sometimes work needs to be done to build trust and relationship and matchmake in a way where both of those partners really have the same underlying values. But my comment is on, I just wanted to express appreciation to the community organizations that participated in the zoning, in informing what you've done. I know that was a lot of work for them, and this work can't be successful if we're not identifying the barriers with the folks who are experiencing them, and then vetting the equitable solutions with them. So just very appreciative of their time. And if you could pass that on to them, I would appreciate that. Thinking in the future, I'm kind of curious, and maybe this is for another day when you come back to present on to us about your future work about the comprehensive plan, equitable policies, and the equitable transit-oriented development. Curious how you're gonna, like, what your engagement strategy is going to be there, what stakeholders you're going to bring together, and how you're going to make sure that work has all the right people at the table. So I think it's more of a comment for now, but I would love to hear that in your future presentations, and I would love to have you come back to present on that future work. Thank you.
And if there's thoughts you've already given to it that you'd like to convey, Vanessa can share it, and then we can hopefully talk about it on the next visit.
Sure.
Matt?
Yeah, I wanted to offer up that, yeah, if you want to contact me about having the AIA or NOMA, the National Organization for Minority Architects, involved in some sort of a clearinghouse matchmaking process. I want to echo Michaela's concerns about how that can be, how that should be done in such a way that it's supporting both, you know, I think equitable or equity in architecture is a big issue as well. And then the other idea that just came to me is with regards to, you know, new development and tenant spaces that become available in order to support those for maybe institutions that might use EDI money. Maybe there's kind of an EDI MFTE, that's a lot of acronyms, but use a tax credit in the development to support tenant spaces for equitable or for, like, you know, institutions that would otherwise, you know, they're never gonna build a building, never gonna avail themselves of the zoning sort of benefits of this program, but may be able to create more spaces throughout the city that way. Thanks.
Great, thanks for that, Matt. Deanna?
I'll be quick. Is there a GIS layer where these projects kind of exist to be able to visualize kind of where they are in Seattle, and also just how this, you know, to Michaela's point, and I see Nick, you put in the chat that you'll be discussing some of the anti-displacement work you'll be doing, but I think it'd be fantastic for the comp plan just to consider, you know, what would be if we did a theoretical exercise of how many of these, you know, developments or projects we'd be wanting to see in different neighborhoods, what is the, let's just say the demand per neighborhood by density and by the type of residents, and where could we see or encourage those projects being implemented in the city? It'd be interesting just to visualize that geographically. Thank you.
Any response to that from you guys?
Sorry, yeah, I didn't know if you wanted to keep these as comments. Briefly on just that first piece. No, there's no single or singular GIS layer that we have available. Probably the most useful thing I could say right now is that we do have a GIS layer for the displacement risk index, and the EDI does target most of their investments to those high risk areas, as you probably know. I bet that team would be interested in trying to showcase kind of where projects are located in something like a future report. We'll pass that along. Yep. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Nick. Okay, we'll move to the public comments portion of our meeting. We provide, as the commission provides, time for public comment at all meetings, but a reminder that we don't hold public hearings and we're an advisory body. We make recommendations to elected officials who in turn make the decisions. Individuals who make to the commission should remember that the mayor and city council make the decisions. We encourage people and organizations to provide their comments to elected officials. And I invite those here today to offer public comment. Please keep your comments to 2 minutes.
Okay, thanks. My name is Ron Horning. I live just off of Aurora on 80th. And when I first looked at this, I really liked it. But when I started reading more and more into it, this 600-foot is important to me because I live on a block with a mega church and across the street is a school. And it is a major arterial just off of Aurora. This should be saved as 600 feet, I believe. Also, reading it more and more, it looks like the charter amendment that was brought up a couple of years ago, 28 and 29, that was thrown out by a judge. This is a problem I've had with this mega church on my block trying to acquire my property. If there's anything in this amendment that will allow them to acquire my property, I would like that written in, that this cannot be used to do that. These renamings to libraries or community centers to acquire extra property and my home, I would like that written in this so it does not happen and will not happen in the future. Both Katie and Nick have been working on this rezone of my area. Katie has been working for I think a year to rezone my property. They just changed that 2 days ago. I want this written in that I will be able to live in my home as long as I want to, and this will not affect that. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Did we have any other public comment?
No other public comment, David. Thank you.
Okay. Is there any other commission business before we adjourn? Okay, yeah, I want to thank you again, Katie and Nick, for being here. We really appreciate all the information, very well presented, very cogent answers to our numerous questions. And we look forward to the next update and for further conversations around the anti-displacement work that we have to come as well. With that, I'll adjourn the meeting. Thank you, and we'll see you all next time.
Thank you all. Appreciate it.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thanks. Goodbye.